So the shaman report relatively constant types of experiences when they're undergoing their transformative experiences. And here's a couple of them. One is climbing the world tree. We've already talked about the world tree. And what that seems to be, if you look at the reports of the shaman, is that their consciousness seems to be able to move itself up and down levels of analysis that aren't necessarily available to you in your normal state of consciousness. Now, whether or not that's a real phenomenon or whether or not it's part associated with the dream isn't exactly clear. So, part of it is, for example, that the shaman become convinced that they can communicate with things like plants at a very fundamental level. But they are also capable of, when they climb up the tree, for example, of entering sort of the realm of their ancestors and communing with them. And I just read a book here recently about the revival of Mongolian shamanism. And the Mongolian situation is kind of interesting because it was a pretty archaic culture. And then the Soviets came in there and communized it, which was sort of economically useful, but socially it was an absolute catastrophe because the Soviets were murderous beyond belief. And then in 1989 they just left. And so the Mongolians, they were completely up in the air then because their traditional culture had been fragmented and, the whole communist thing was a bust. And they reverted back to shamanic practices. And the shaman told them that part of the reason that they were all suffering was because they had lost contact with their ancestral spirits. And partly what they meant by that was that the continuity of the culture had been disrupted. And so people were identityless. And it was funny because when Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote about the Soviet Union, and he wrote extensively about the Soviet experience, his eventual conclusion was that the best route for the Soviets to take after the collapse of communism would be a return to the sort of evolutionary process of development that characterized their exploration of Orthodox Christianity. Because you have to fall back to something, because people need a meaning structure. And, modern people have a hard time with incomprehensible religious meaning structures because, we demand a certain amount of rational clarity. But there's a problem with that because the absolute mysteries of life cannot be formulated with rational clarity. You have to kind of encapsulate them in a mystery that's partially understandable because otherwise they stay completely out of your grasp, and you have no answer to the question, well, what's the ultimate purpose of life? Well, you're not going to be able to get that answer in a really tight box, that you could open up and it's just going to provide all the answers. It's going to be murky, partly because it has to apply to everyone. But the fact that it's murky and symbolic in a sense and sort of multifaceted doesn't mean it's unnecessary or wrong. And, the more I've studied the theories that underlie personality theory, the more I've become convinced, and for me, convinced beyond a doubt, that our connection to the archaic structures of the past that defined our cultures, without that, you're without roots. And that makes you weak. That's the big problem. It makes you weak. There's nothing to you. Every whim can possess you. Every stupid political idea that comes along is instantly your God. And you're certainly capable of going crazy with masses of people in all sorts of insane ways. It has direct consequences. You have to be grounded in something.